He led a revolution and refused to be king. He was George Washington. I'm your host and you're watching this channel. George Washington was born in 1732 in Virginia. His father had been wealthy, but by the time George was 11, he was poor. Growing up, George managed his family's estate. And though he didn't have much schooling, he taught himself many subjects, including surveying. In 1748, at age 16, he became a surveyor. And by the time he was in his early 20s, he was considered one of the best in the colony. As a young man, Washington joined the colonial militia and rose to the rank of major. Then in 1753, he was sent to deliver a message to the British fort in the Ohio Valley. The trip was part diplomatic mission, part vacation. But things took a turn when Washington realized that the French were also in the valley. To see them, he continued on to a French fort. On the way, he got lost in the woods and stumbled upon a clearing. There he found a silver mine. He didn't know it at the time, but this discovery would cause friction between Britain and France for years to come. Eventually, Washington reached the French fort and delivered his message. It was basically an eviction notice, but the French governor rebuffed him. Though tensions were high, Washington didn't stick around to find out what would happen next. He returned to Virginia and continued working in the militia. In 1754, the French and Indian War began. The war would end up being part of the larger 7 Years' War that would be fought in Europe, Africa, and Asia. It was a global war about wealth, power, and territory. But for Washington, it was about proving himself. During the war, he honed his military skills and learned the importance of logistics. He worked closely with troops from various Native American nations and gained their respect. But even with all of his experience, he suffered some serious defeats. By 1758, the war was going poorly for the British. So the following year, the British governor of Virginia appointed Washington to lead the colony's militia. One of Washington's first acts was to take prisoners in a surprise attack on a fort in western Pennsylvania. The war would go on for another 5 years, but after the Battle of Fort Necessity, George Washington's name was known throughout the colonies. But by the 1760s, the tide was turning against the French. And in 1763, they made peace with Britain. For Britain, the war had drained its treasury. So to make up for the cost, the British Parliament passed a series of laws that taxed the American colonies. The colonists weren't happy, but they did have representation in Parliament. They could petition their concerns and even vote members into office. Still, the tensions remained high. In 1770, when British soldiers fired on a crowd of protesters in Boston, it seemed as if violence might erupt. But the country's leaders calmed everyone down and the crisis passed. But as the decade wore on, things got worse again. In 1773, the British East India Company was given a monopoly on all tea sales in the colonies. This meant that the colonists couldn't buy tea anywhere else, even if they paid more. The colonists protested, but Britain enforced the law. Then on December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians snuck onto 3 ships carrying tea and dumped it into the Boston harbor. Britain responded harshly, closing the port of Boston until the men were found and punished. Other colonies rallied to Boston's defense, and soon it seemed as if the entire country would descend into chaos. It was during this time that the men who would become known as the Founding Fathers met in Philadelphia to discuss the crisis. Many wanted independence from Britain, but others, like George Washington, felt that breaking away would be a last resort. Washington knew that he would be called on to lead the fight for independence, and he began preparing for war. Before the war began, he wrote to a friend that he felt as if a fire was going to burn him up. Although Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he wasn't popular with everyone. Many thought that he was too aristocratic, and others felt that he lacked military experience. But as the war dragged on, Washington proved them wrong. He kept his army together through the winter at Valley Forge, and eventually defeated the British at Yorktown in 1781. After the war, there were calls for Washington to become king, but he refused. Instead, he returned to his home in Virginia. He could have stayed on as commander-in-chief, but he preferred to live as a farmer. However, in 1789, he was called back to serve as the first president of the newly formed United States of America. As president, Washington set many precedents for the office, such as refusing to wear a fancy uniform or to live in the White House. But perhaps his greatest legacy is this: he left office after serving 2 terms, setting the example for the country's future presidents. I've been your host. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.